Like many people, I have oftentimes been drawn to the escapism of fantasy. From video games to films to literature, there has always been something awe-inspiring about fantastical worlds full of magic, dragons, and adventure. Stories about great heroes tasked with grand quests in order to save the realm from some great evil. However, like most forms of fiction, fantasy is affected by real-world ideology and cultural hegemony, and as a result ends up perpetuating some rather problematic worldviews, most notably Orientalism. Have you ever noticed that whenever you're watching a fantasy film or playing a fantasy RPG, there is almost always a very clearly defined group that is good and a clearly defined evil? Usually the good guys have a very European look, regardless of if they are humans, dwarves, or hobbits, and the evil is usually placed as an other. This other is always a threat to the realms of good and usually portrayed as barbaric, savage, uncivilized societies ruled by chaos and disorder. Oftentimes we accept without question that the ways of our hero's culture is correct and just. There is never any need for justification because we are very clearly shown how the heroes are good and the other is evil and wrong. There is rarely any more depth beyond the principal dichotomy of good and evil. Unlike our own world, where Orientalist accounts of the Orient were practically a European fantasy that did little to reflect the reality of the Orient, and therefore created a fictional Orient that then went on to become the reality that the West interpreted to be the non-Western world, in fantasy worlds there is no reality under the fiction. There is no real Mordor under the story of Mordor. The Mordor that Tolkien describes is the reality that we must accept. Now, when we look at Orientalism, we can usually contrast Western viewpoints with that of the other. And in doing so, we can see the Orientalism in European viewpoints. But within fantasy, there is no way for us to learn different viewpoints except for the ones presented by the creators of the fiction. A problem then arises when we begin to think about how the Orientalism inside the fantasy genre can then further reinforce Orientalist views in our own world. This is where representation plays a role. Sure, we may be talking about fantastical settings and people, but those creations have inspirations and tropes that are based off real-world places and people. These representations go on to reinforce Orientalist stereotypes inside our minds, therefore reinforcing Orientalist cultural hegemony. Now, in some ways, I may be generalizing the fantasy genre as a whole. There may very well be varying examples of creators subverting the Orientalism inside the genre and deconstructing it. But generally, this is a problem that can be found in some of the most well-known fantasy titles and gets reproduced in their cheapest imitations. And unfortunately, Orientalism in fantasy fiction is often left ignored due to its fantastical settings. The fantastical worlds in the fantasy genre are detached enough from our own world for us to ignore the parallels between the settings and narratives inside fantasy fiction and those in our own world. The escapist element in the genre creates a distancing effect where we often fail to grasp how Orientalism permeates throughout the genre, meaning that while there may be less Orientalist depictions in other forms of fiction, the fantasy genre is still very much swimming in it. This is something we must work to change. We shouldn't ignore Orientalist narratives inside fantasy fiction, just as we shouldn't ignore it in any other form of fiction. We should recognize it for what it is and work towards eliminating it from future fiction in the fantasy genre, especially if we wish to eventually get rid of Orientalism altogether. Hey, if you're hearing this, then that means that you've reached the end of the video. Yeah, I don't really have anything more to say other than, I guess, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I guess drop down a like, maybe subscribe. But yeah, not really sure what more things I'll do with the videos, but if anyone's got any suggestions, you can drop it down in the comments. I'm trying to basically, this is mainly a politics channel, I guess, with some breakdowns of maybe some other stuff. I don't really know yet, but we'll see where it goes. Anyways, thanks for watching, and till next time.